The night air was cool as Judge Wilson drove home from the community center. He had just finished speaking at a fundraiser for the local youth program, something he deeply cared about. After 15 years as a criminal court judge, he still believed in giving back to the neighborhood where he grew up. Wilson loosened his tie and smiled, thinking about the eager faces of the teenagers at the event. Many of them reminded him of himself at that age, full of dreams but facing tough challenges. His car radio played soft jazz as he turned onto Maple Street, just 3 blocks from his house in the quiet suburb. The flash of blue and red lights in his mirror caught him by surprise. Wilson checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run any stop signs or made any illegal turns. Still, he did exactly what he always told people in his courtroom to do. He put on his turn signal, pulled over to the curb, and kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. Through his side mirror, Wilson watched 2 officers step out of their patrol car. The taller one approached with his hand resting on his holster, while the shorter officer circled around to the passenger side. Something about their body language made Wilson uneasy. "Evening, officers," Wilson said politely as the window came down. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The taller officer shined his flashlight directly into Wilson's eyes, making him squint. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood," he said, his voice hard and cold. "What are you doing around here at this time of night?" Wilson blinked against the bright light. "I live here, officer. I'm just heading home from a community event." The second officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. Everyone lives here when they get pulled over." Wilson took a deep breath, keeping his tone respectful. "I understand you're doing your job, but I've lived on Cedar Avenue for over 10 years. I'm a judge at the county courthouse. If you'd like to see my ID." "A judge?" The first officer cut him off with a laugh. "Sure you are. Step out of the vehicle, sir." Wilson hesitated, confusion crossing his face. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm happy to show you my judicial credentials." "I said step out of the vehicle." The officer's voice rose sharply. "Now." Neighbors' porch lights began flicking on as Wilson carefully opened his door. He was no longer wearing his judicial robes or sitting behind his bench. Tonight, he was just a black man in jeans and a polo shirt, being treated like a criminal in front of his own community. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the first officer ordered, while the second one moved closer. "I'm reaching for my wallet," Wilson explained carefully, moving his hand slowly toward his back pocket. "My judicial ID is." He's reaching. The second officer lunged forward, grabbing Wilson's arm and twisting it behind his back. Within seconds, cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "What are you doing?" Wilson asked, shock evident in his voice. "This is completely unnecessary." The first officer patted him down roughly. "People like you always claim to be something you're not." Mrs. Chen, Wilson's neighbor from across the street, emerged from her house in a bathrobe. "What's going on? That's Judge Wilson. What are you doing to him?" Other neighbors appeared on their porches, some holding up phones, recording the scene. "Mind your business, ma'am," the second officer called out. "Police matter." Wilson stood tall despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists. "I've done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "This is a mistake." The officers ignored him, searching his car without permission. They rifled through his briefcase, scattering papers with court seals across the seat. "Nothing here," the second officer reported. "We're still taking him in," the first decided, resisting arrest. Wilson shook his head in disbelief as they guided him toward the patrol car. "I didn't resist anything," he protested. As they pushed him into the backseat, Wilson caught sight of his neighbors watching, their faces filled with concern and anger. Little did these officers know that the man they were treating like a common criminal would be sitting on the bench in courtroom 4B come Monday morning, the very same courtroom where their case would be heard. The patrol car's backseat was hard and uncomfortable. Judge Wilson sat straight, his wrists still cuffed behind him, as the officers drove him away from his neighborhood. Through the window, he could see his neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, some still holding their phones up, recording everything. "You're making a serious mistake," Wilson said calmly. His heart was racing, but his voice remained steady, the same voice that commanded respect in his courtroom every day. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Officer Brooks, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Everyone says that." I'm a sitting judge in this county, Wilson repeated. If you just check my ID. Enough with the judge story, the second officer, Officer Reeves, cut in. We've had it all before. Wilson fell silent, watching the familiar streets pass by. This wasn't his first experience with prejudice, but it had been years since he'd been treated with such blatant disrespect. As a young law student, he'd been stopped many times for fitting descriptions, all looking suspicious. He'd hoped those days were behind him, especially in his own neighborhood. At the police station, they led him through a side entrance. The bright fluorescent lights made Wilson squint after the darkness of the patrol car. A few officers at desks looked up as they passed, then quickly looked away. One woman officer frowned slightly, as if something didn't seem right about the scene. "Sit here." Officer Brooks pushed him down onto a hard bench. Finally, he removed the handcuffs, but only to replace them with one cuff attached to a metal bar on the bench. "Wait." Wilson rubbed his wrist where the metal had dug into his skin. "I have the right to make a phone call." "You'll get your call when we're done processing you," Officer Reeves replied, dropping into a chair and starting to fill out paperwork. "What exactly am I being charged with?" Wilson asked. "Resisting arrest and suspicious behavior," Officer Brooks answered without looking up. "Suspicious behavior isn't a crime," Wilson pointed out. "And I didn't resist anything." Officer Reeves snorted. "Tell it to the judge." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Wilson. He almost wanted to laugh, but the situation was far too serious. Instead, he sat quietly, watching other people being processed, most of them getting their phone calls right away, moving through the system quickly. Hours passed, and each time he requested his call, the officers claimed the system was backed up or there was a computer issue. Around midnight, a police captain walked through the processing area. He stopped suddenly when he saw Wilson. "Judge Wilson." The captain's eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Officer Brooks looked up sharply. "You know this guy?" The captain frowned. "Of course I know him. He's Judge Wilson. He presides over half the criminal cases in this county." He turned to Wilson. "Sir, I don't understand what's happening here." "That makes two of us, Captain Taylor," Wilson replied. "I was pulled over 3 blocks from my home, treated like a criminal, and brought here without cause." Captain Taylor's face darkened. He turned to the officers. "Uncuff him. Now." Officer Reeves hesitated. "But the paperwork." "I said now." The captain's voice was steel. As soon as the cuff was removed, Wilson stood up, straightening his shirt. "I'd like to make that phone call now." The captain personally escorted him to the phone. "I'm deeply sorry about this, Your Honor. I'll look into it immediately." Wilson nodded but said nothing as he dialed his colleague, Judge Rivera. "It's Wilson," he said when she answered. "I've been arrested." "Yes, you heard that right." He explained the situation quickly. "They did what?" Judge Rivera's voice was loud enough that even the captain could hear her outrage. "I'm coming down there right now." "No need," Wilson said. "I think I'm about to be released, but I'll need a ride home. My car's been impounded." By the time he hung up, the captain had returned with his personal belongings in a plastic bag. "You're free to go, Your Honor. Again, I apologize for this incident." "I'm free to go," Wilson repeated slowly. "But aren't the charges dropped?" The captain looked uncomfortable. "The system already processed the paperwork. You have a court date for Monday morning." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Monday morning? In which courtroom?" "Courtroom 4B," the captain replied, checking the paperwork. Wilson couldn't help but smile slightly. "That's my courtroom, Captain." The realization dawned on the captain's face. "Oh. Yes, sir," Wilson said. "I believe Officers Brooks and Reeves will be very surprised on Monday morning. And I believe we all have a lot to discuss about what happened here tonight." As Judge Rivera's car pulled up outside, Wilson turned back to the captain. "I'll see you in court, Captain. All of you." "Judge Wilson, I just heard about last night. I want to personally apologize." "Save it for Monday," Wilson interrupted. "I'd like you in my courtroom too." "Your courtroom? But surely you'll recuse yourself from—" "Of course I'll recuse myself from my own case," Wilson said. "But before I do, I think we need to have a very public conversation about what's happening in your department." He hung up and watched the sunrise through his window. In 15 years on the bench, he had always prided himself on being fair, on following the letter of the law. But had he been looking closely enough at how that law was being enforced? At who was being brought before him and why? For the first time in years, Judge Wilson questioned whether he had truly been serving justice, and he made himself a promise. What happened to him wouldn't be swept under the rug. It would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire system. His doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chen from across the street, holding a container of food. "I saw what happened last night," she said simply. "Are you okay?" Wilson managed a small smile. "I will be. And thank you." As Mrs. Chen left, Wilson's phone began ringing non-stop. News traveled fast. By Monday, everyone would know what had happened, including Officers Brooks and Reeves. And Wilson would be ready. By Saturday morning, Judge Wilson's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friends, colleagues, other judges. Word had spread like wildfire. His neighbor Mrs. Chen had shared the video she took with her daughter, who posted it online. Now it was everywhere. Wilson sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists again. He kept hearing Officer Brooks' dismissive tone. "People like you always claim to be something you're not." The doorbell rang. It was his friend Thomas, a defense attorney he'd known since law school. "I came as soon as I heard," Thomas said, walking in with a bag of pastries from Wilson's favorite bakery. "This is unbelievable." Wilson managed a tired smile. "Thanks for coming." They sat in Wilson's living room, surrounded by law books and family photos. On the wall hung Wilson's law degree and his judicial appointment certificate, signed by the governor. 15 years on the bench, and last night he'd been treated like a common criminal. "I've already watched the videos," Thomas said, opening his laptop. "Mrs. Chen's, plus 2 others from different neighbors, and I pulled some strings at the department, got copies of the body camera footage too." He turned the screen toward Wilson. "You should see this." Wilson watched himself on the screen, calm and respectful, even as the officers grew aggressive. He saw himself clearly stating he was a judge, saw Officer Reeves laugh in response. He watched as he slowly reached for his ID and was suddenly slammed against his car. "They had no probable cause," Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. "No reason to stop you. No reason to search your car. No reason to arrest you. This is textbook racial profiling." Wilson nodded slowly. "I know. You need to file a formal complaint. Today. We need to." "Wait," Wilson held up his hand. "I've been thinking about this all night. If I file a complaint now, before Monday's hearing, they'll just reassign the case. Those officers will never have to face me in court." Thomas frowned. "So what's your plan?" "Let them come to court on Monday," Wilson said. "Let them see who I am. Let them understand what they've done, not just to me, but to the integrity of the system." Outside, a small group of people had gathered at the end of Wilson's driveway. Some held signs, "Justice for Judge Wilson," and "Stop Racial Profiling." Wilson's phone buzzed with a text from Judge Rivera. "Press conference at police headquarters in 30 minutes. Are you watching?" They turned on the TV just in time to see the police chief step up to a forest of microphones. He looked uncomfortable, his uniform perfectly pressed, but his face strained. "The department is aware of an incident involving a respected member of our judicial community," the chief began. "We are conducting a thorough internal investigation. The officers involved have been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of this investigation." A reporter shouted, "Is it true they arrested Judge Wilson without cause?" The chief cleared his throat. "I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation." Another voice, "Did they know he was a judge when they arrested him?" "No comment at this time." "Is this a case of racial profiling?" The chief's face tightened. "We take all allegations seriously. That's all for now." The press conference ended abruptly, with reporters still shouting questions. "Administrative duty," Thomas scoffed. "They should be suspended without pay." Wilson's phone rang again. It was the district attorney. "Judge Wilson, I just wanted to assure you that my office is taking this matter extremely seriously," she said. "I'll be in court on Monday personally." After he hung up, Thomas looked at Wilson. "Everyone's scrambling. They're afraid of what you might do." Good, Wilson said quietly. They should be. By Sunday evening, the crowd outside Wilson's house had grown to over 100 people. Community leaders gave speeches. College students passed out water bottles. Local news vans lined the street. Wilson watched from his window, touched by the support but uncomfortable with the attention. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. His sister called from out of state. "I saw you on the national news," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her. "But I'm thinking about all the people this happens to who don't have law degrees, who don't have neighbors with cameras, who don't become hashtags." That night, Wilson laid out his judicial robes for the morning. He polished his shoes until they gleamed. He prepared his remarks, short, dignified, but unmistakably clear about the gravity of what had occurred. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he thought about Officers Brooks and Reeves. By this time tomorrow, they would understand exactly who they had handcuffed and thrown into that holding cell. They would stand before him in his courtroom and face the consequences of their actions. And Judge Wilson would be ready. Monday morning arrived with a clear blue sky and unusual activity around the county courthouse. News vans lined the street. Protesters gathered on the steps, holding signs and chanting for justice. Police officers stood in a line, keeping order but looking uncomfortable. Inside, courtroom 4B was packed. Every bench was filled. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder in the back row. Law students squeezed into any available space, whispering excitedly. The district attorney sat in the front, surrounded by her team, all in crisp suits and serious expressions. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Officers Brooks and Reeves walked in through the side door. They wore their dress uniforms, pressed and polished for court. They carried their hats under their arms and held thin folders containing their reports. Their faces showed confidence. They had done this hundreds of times before. Stand before the judge, present the facts, get the case on the docket. Simple routine. "Man, it's crowded today." Officer Reeves whispered to Brooks. "What's going on?" Officer Brooks shrugged. "Probably some high-profile case after hours." They didn't notice how the room fell silent as they approached the front. They didn't see the knowing looks exchanged between spectators. They stood at their usual spot, arranging their paperwork, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The bailiff, a tall woman who had served in the courthouse for 20 years, cleared her throat. "All rise," she called out, her voice stronger than usual. "The Honorable Judge Wilson Presiding." A door opened behind the bench. The officers still didn't look up, busy with their papers. "Docket number 7328, Officer Brooks said, reading from his folder. "Arrest made Friday night for resisting arrest and suspicious behavior." Suspect was. Then he stopped. His head snapped up as something about the name on his report finally registered. He looked at the bench for the first time. Judge Wilson sat there, his black robes perfectly pressed, his expression calm and steady. Their eyes met. Officer Brooks' mouth fell open. The papers in his hand trembled slightly. "Your Honor," he stammered. We." Officer Reeves, confused by his partner's sudden silence, looked up too. The color drained from his face so quickly he swayed slightly on his feet. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Judge Wilson's gaze moved between the two officers. He said nothing, letting the moment stretch out painfully. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notebooks. The district attorney watched the officers with a tight smile. Officers Brooks and Reeves. Judge Wilson finally spoke, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I believe you were about to tell the court about an arrest you made Friday night." Officer Brooks swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "Your Honor, there seems to be a mistake." "A mistake?" Judge Wilson repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Please enlighten the court." Officer Reeves jumped in. "We didn't know it was you, Your Honor. We would never have." "You would never have what, Officer Reeves?" Judge Wilson interrupted. "You would never have pulled over a judge. Or you would never have pulled over anyone if you knew they were a person of authority." The question hung in the air. Officer Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it again. People in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Others whispered to each other. "Because the question before us," Judge Wilson continued, "is not about who I am. It's about how our justice system treats every citizen who comes into contact with it. It's about whether we truly believe in equal protection under the law. He looked directly at the officers. It's about whether someone should be treated differently because they're a judge or because they're not. Officer Brooks looked down at his shoes. Officer Reeves stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Judge Wilson picked up his gavel. Now, regarding the charges against me. The district attorney stood up. Your Honor, if I may. The state wishes to dismiss all charges immediately. I appreciate that, Judge Wilson nodded. But first, I must recuse myself from this case. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The officers looked up, confused. I cannot preside over a case in which I am the defendant, Judge Wilson explained. That would be a clear conflict of interest. This case will be reassigned to Judge Rivera in courtroom 2A. He turned to the officers. However, before I step down from this particular matter, I want to be very clear about something. The room fell silent again. What happened to me on Friday night was not just about me. It was about a system that allows certain people to be treated as less than others. It was about officers who use their badges as shields against accountability. It was about the thousands of citizens who face these same injustices but don't have the platform I have to speak about it. Officer Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Officer Reeves stared at the floor. I will be filing a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, Judge Wilson continued. I will be requesting a full investigation into the conduct of both officers involved, and I will be using my position to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else in this county. He looked out at the packed courtroom. This is not about revenge. This is about reform. This is about justice, real justice, for everyone. With that, he banged his gavel once. This court is in recess for 15 minutes. When we return, Judge Rivera will take over this case. As Judge Wilson stood to leave, the entire courtroom rose as well. The officers remained frozen in place, their faces ashen, their uniforms suddenly seeming too tight around their necks. They had come to court expecting business as usual. Instead, they had come face to face with the very man they had handcuffed and humiliated, now sitting in the position of power he had tried to tell them about all along. And they knew, as they watched him walk out with his head held high, that their lives would never be the same again. Judge Wilson sat in the small conference room behind courtroom 4B, his hands folded on the table. Across from him, the chief judge of the county court system leaned forward with concern in his eyes. You handled that perfectly, the chief judge said. But are you sure you're all right? Wilson loosened his collar slightly. The weight of what had just happened was still sinking in. I'm fine, but this isn't about me anymore. A knock on the door interrupted them. Judge Rivera entered, her judicial robes flowing as she walked briskly to the table. I've dismissed all charges, she said without preamble. The district attorney didn't even argue. Those officers looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them whole. Wilson nodded. Thank you for taking the case. Did you see their faces? Rivera shook her head. I don't think I've ever seen two people more shocked in my entire career. The chief judge cleared his throat. Wilson, the media is clamoring for a statement. The courthouse steps are packed. What do you want to do? Wilson thought for a moment. He hadn't become a judge for publicity. He had always preferred to work quietly, to let his rulings speak for themselves, but now he found himself at the center of a story that was bigger than him. I'll speak, he said finally, but not about my case specifically, about what it represents. 20 minutes later, Wilson stood at a podium outside the courthouse. Camera flashes popped like lightning. Microphones clustered in front of him like steel flowers. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. I've spent 15 years on the bench, he said, his voice calm but carrying to the back of the crowd. In that time, I've seen thousands of cases. I've sentenced people to prison. I've granted second chances. I've tried every day to uphold both the letter and the spirit of the law. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. What happened to me on Friday night was wrong, but it wasn't unique. Every day, people in our community face the same treatment, or worse, without the benefit of a law degree, without the protection of their position, without cameras recording the incident. In the crowd, he spotted Mrs. Chen nodding. Next to her stood the young man who had been in the holding cell with him, the one worried about his scholarship. Today, I recused myself from my own case because that's what ethics demand. But I will not recuse myself from the larger conversation we need to have about justice in our community, about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't, about how we train our officers and what we expect from them. At the edges of the crowd, Officers Brooks and Reeves stood with the police chief. They had changed into civilian clothes, but Wilson recognized them immediately. Their expressions were hard to read, a mix of shame, defiance, and uncertainty. "I don't want these officers fired," Wilson continued, causing murmurs of surprise. "That would be easy, but it wouldn't solve anything." The crowd grew quiet again. "Instead, I want accountability. I want change. I want our police department to look at its training, its culture, its unconscious biases. I want body camera footage reviewed not just when there's a complaint, but randomly and regularly. I want community oversight with real teeth." He looked directly at the police chief. "And I want every officer to spend a night in a holding cell as part of their training, to know what it feels like to have your freedom taken away, to understand the enormous power they hold over people's lives." The chief's eyes widened slightly, but he gave a small nod. Wilson turned back to the crowd. "What happened to me has happened before, and it will happen again unless we make real changes. I'm asking everyone, the courts, the police department, the community, to work together to ensure that justice truly is blind, that it doesn't see color or status or uniform, that it sees only facts, law, and humanity." As he stepped away from the podium, the questions came fast and loud. "Judge Wilson, will you sue the department? Are you calling for the officers to be punished? Do you think this was racial profiling?" Wilson raised a hand for quiet. "I've said what I needed to say. Now it's time for action, not more words." Back inside, the chief judge caught up with him in the hallway. "Powerful statement. But now what?" "Now," Wilson said, "we get to work." Later that afternoon, Wilson returned to his chambers. His desk was piled high with messages of support from other judges, from community leaders, from ordinary citizens. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. He sat down heavily in his chair. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the cold metal of the handcuffs, the humiliation, the helplessness. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His clerk poked her head in. "Judge, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." Wilson nodded. "Send them in." To his surprise, Officer Brooks stepped into the room. Alone, without his uniform, he seemed smaller somehow, less sure of himself. "Your Honor," Brooks began, his voice catching slightly. "I came to apologize. What I did was wrong." Wilson studied him for a long moment. "Sit down, Officer Brooks." Brooks lowered himself into the chair across from the desk, perching on the edge as if ready to flee. "I'm not here to ask for mercy," Brooks said. "I deserve whatever happens. But I want you to know, I've been thinking about what you said in court, about equal protection, about justice." Wilson leaned forward. And you're right," Brooks admitted. "I wouldn't have treated you that way if I had known who you were. That's the problem, isn't it? That we treat people differently based on who we think they are." Wilson nodded slowly. "That's exactly the problem." "I want to be part of the solution," Brooks said, "if you'll let me." For the first time since Friday night, Wilson felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this after all. "Officer Brooks," he said, "I think that's where justice really begins." 6 months had passed since that night when Judge Wilson was wrongfully arrested. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, leaves turning golden on the trees lining the courthouse square. But the changes in the county went far deeper than the seasons. Wilson stood at the window of his chambers, watching people come and go below. Some faces he recognized from his courtroom. Others were strangers, going about their daily business. All of them had been affected, in ways big and small, by what had happened that Friday night. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. His clerk entered, carrying a folder. "The Police Oversight Committee reports are ready for your review, Judge." Wilson nodded, taking the folder. "Thank you." After the door closed, he sat at his desk and opened the folder. Charts, statistics, and recommendations filled the pages, the result of the new civilian oversight committee that had been created in the wake of his arrest. The committee reviewed police practices, analyzed traffic stop data, and made recommendations for improvement. The numbers told a story. Traffic stops were down 30% overall, but more balanced across all neighborhoods. Complaints against officers had decreased by 25%. Officer-involved incidents requiring force had dropped by almost half. Wilson ran his finger down the page to the section about Officer Reeves. After a disciplinary hearing, Reeves had been terminated from the force. The evidence against him, not just from Wilson's case, but from a pattern of similar behavior, had been too strong to ignore. He turned the page to find information about Officer Brooks. Unlike his partner, Brooks had taken a different path. After that day in Wilson's chambers, Brooks had volunteered to become part of the solution. He was now leading training sessions for other officers, sharing his experience and what he'd learned from it. His story had become a powerful teaching tool. Wilson closed the folder and checked his watch. It was almost time. Downstairs in the main conference room, chairs were arranged in a semicircle. People filed in: judges, police officers, community activists, ordinary citizens. This monthly forum had become another outcome of that fateful night, a place where people from all parts of the justice system could speak openly about problems and solutions. Wilson slipped in quietly and took a seat at the back. He preferred to listen rather than lead these sessions. Today's topic was building trust between police and communities of color. The police chief stood at the front of the room, looking much more comfortable than he had 6 months ago at that hastily called press conference. "We've made progress," the chief was saying, "but we still have a long way to go. Officer Brooks, would you share your perspective?" Brooks, no longer in uniform but wearing a training division polo shirt, stepped forward. His face had changed over these months, less rigid, more thoughtful. "Before last summer, I thought I was one of the good ones," Brooks began. "I told myself I treated everyone fairly. But when Judge Wilson asked us that question in court, whether we would have treated him the same way if we'd known he was a judge, I couldn't honestly say yes." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "That's when I realized the problem wasn't just a few bad officers," Brooks continued. "It was a culture that allowed us to see some people as threats and others as citizens, to give some people the benefit of the doubt and others none at all." From across the room, Mrs. Chen raised her hand. Wilson smiled slightly, remembering how she had been the first neighbor to record his arrest, the first to bring him food the next day. Now she was a regular at these forums, never shy about speaking her mind. "The cameras have helped," she said when called on. "Knowing that officers are being watched makes us feel safer. But what about the officers who turn them off?" The chief nodded. "That's why we implemented the new policy. Any officer whose camera is off during an incident is automatically suspended pending investigation. No exceptions." The discussion continued, sometimes heated but always respectful. Wilson watched as people who might never have spoken to each other before, a teenage boy from the South Side, a veteran officer nearing retirement, a mother who had lost her son to police violence years ago, found common ground in their desire for justice. When the forum ended, Wilson walked back to his chambers slowly, greeting people along the way. Outside his door stood a young man he recognized, the same one who had shared the holding cell with him that night, worried about losing his scholarship. "Judge Wilson," the young man said, extending his hand. "I don't know if you remember me." "Of course I do," Wilson replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I just wanted to thank you," the young man said. "After that night, after what you did, things changed. I got to tell my story too. People listened." Wilson nodded. "That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be heard, to be seen as who we really are." Later that evening, Wilson drove home along the same route where he'd been pulled over 6 months ago. As he passed the spot, he no longer felt the flash of anger and humiliation that had lingered for weeks after the incident. Instead, he felt something like peace. His phone rang through the car speaker. It was Judge Rivera. "Have you seen the news?" she asked without preamble. "The state legislature just passed that police reform bill, the one based on our county's new policies." Wilson smiled. "That's great news." "They're calling it the Wilson Act," she said. "How does it feel to have a law named after you?" Wilson thought for a moment as he turned onto his street. It feels like something good came from something bad, like maybe it was all worth it. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw Mrs. Chen watering flowers in her front yard. She waved, and he waved back. His neighborhood felt different now, not just because people recognized him from the news, but because they had come together in a way they never had before. Wilson had never wanted to be at the center of a story about injustice. He had never asked to become a symbol or have a law named after him. But sometimes, he reflected as he walked to his front door, the most important cases in life weren't the ones you presided over in court. They were the ones that changed you, and through you changed the world around you. And that, he decided, was justice in its truest form. Judge Rivera pulled up to the curb outside the police station just as Wilson stepped through the glass doors. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and she wore jeans and a sweatshirt, clearly having rushed over as soon as she got his call. "I can't believe this," she said, opening the passenger door from inside. "Are you okay?" Wilson slid into the seat, the events of the evening weighing heavily on him. "Physically, yes, my pride's a bit bruised." As they drove through the quiet streets, Wilson stared out the window, replaying the night's events in his mind. He had spent nearly 5 hours in that holding cell, a small, cold room with concrete benches and walls covered in scratches from previous occupants. The smell of bleach couldn't hide the underlying odors of sweat and fear. "You know," Wilson said finally, breaking the silence, "I've sentenced hundreds of people to jail time. I always told myself I understood what that meant for them." Judge Rivera glanced at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. "And now?" "Now I know I had no idea," he admitted. "That holding cell, it strips away your dignity, your humanity." During those 5 hours, Wilson had shared the cell with 3 other men. One was a young guy, couldn't have been more than 20, arrested for fighting outside a bar. Another was middle-aged, picked up for public intoxication. The third was an older man who didn't speak much English, confused about why he'd been detained. None of them knew Wilson was a judge, and he didn't tell them. Instead, he listened to their stories. The young man worried about losing his scholarship, the middle-aged man who had just lost his job that day, the older man who kept repeating his daughter's phone number, hoping someone would call her. "The worst part wasn't the cell," Wilson continued. "It was watching how differently everyone was treated. Some guys were processed in 20 minutes. Others were ignored for hours, and it wasn't random who got which treatment." Judge Rivera nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "One officer, Harris, I think his name was, he was decent, treated everyone the same, answered questions honestly. But the others," Wilson shook his head. "They enjoyed the power, making people wait, ignoring requests, small humiliations that don't break any rules but break people's spirits." They turned onto Wilson's street. The neighborhood was quiet now, porch lights off, everyone asleep. His car was still gone, probably in the police impound lot. "You know what really got to me?" Wilson said as they pulled into his driveway. "When Captain Taylor finally recognized me, suddenly everything changed. Suddenly I was Your Honor again. Suddenly the computer system worked fine. Suddenly I could make my phone call." He turned to look at Judge Rivera. "What about the others who don't have a title? Who don't have colleagues who can rush down to help them? Who don't have the system on speed dial?" Judge Rivera turned off the engine. "What are you going to do?" Wilson looked at his house, the perfect lawn, the expensive curtains, the security system, all the things that were supposed to protect him from exactly what had happened tonight. "Monday morning, those officers will walk into my courtroom," he said slowly. "They'll expect to see some other judge. They'll expect business as usual." He opened the car door. "But it won't be business as usual. Not anymore." Inside his house, Wilson couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, still in the clothes he'd been arrested in, making notes, not just about what had happened to him, but about what he'd seen happen to others, the systematic delays, the selective enforcement, the small abuses of power that added up to something much larger. At dawn, his phone rang. It was the chief of police.